February 20th, 2026. Not the morning of the raid, not the day the helicopters lifted off. February 20th. That is the date that ended a 15-year manhunt before most of the world knew the circle was closing. That is the data single surveillance thread, not a tip line, not a paid informant with a phone number, but a patient. Methodical tracking of one trusted man connected to one woman connected to one of the most wanted fugitives alive, finally pulled tight. 2 days before 6 military helicopters were deployed. 2 days before Special Forces units moved into position in states surrounding Jalisco without entering Jalisco itself. 2 days before Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes, known universally as El Mencho, stayed in one place long enough for everything to end. He had built a criminal organization with an estimated $50 billion in total assets. He carried a $15 million bounty from the United States government and a 300 million peso reward from Mexico. He had been indicted multiple times in federal courts in Washington. He had survived more than a decade of the combined intelligence resources of 2 governments. He moved constantly. He communicated almost never electronically. He kept his face so hidden that most people in the world had genuinely never seen what he looked like. And in the end, the thread that unraveled everything was not a sophisticated digital intercept. It was a trusted man transporting a woman to a cabin in the mountains above a small town in Jalisco called Tapalpa, 90 kilometers south of Guadalajara. What happened in those mountains on February 22nd, 2026 was not simply a military operation. It was the end of something that had been building for 15 years. And what came after, in at least 20 of Mexico's 32 states, on roads and gas stations and government buildings and the streets of cities that had lived under his cartels. Power for over a decade is the question that Mexico and the United States are still trying to fully answer. Because El Mencho is dead, the CJNG is not. And between those 2 facts lies everything that matters about what comes next, before we trace how this happened and what it actually means. If you are watching cases and events like this one and you want analysis that goes beyond the headline, subscribe and turn on notifications. We examine the evidence here. We trace the timelines. We look at what is actually happening beneath the surface of the news cycle. Hit that like button and drop a comment. Do you believe El Mencho's death weakens the CJNG long term, or does the fragmentation that follows make the organization more dangerous? Yes, no? Let's go back to the beginning. Because you cannot understand what happened in Tapalpa without understanding the man they were hunting and the organization he built. Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes was born on July 17, 1966, in the rural community of Culitatlan, in the municipality of Aguililla, in the western state of Michoacán. The region is part of what Mexicans call the Tierra Caliente, the Hotland, one of the most historically impoverished and most criminally contested territories in the country. There was no inherited wealth, no family dynasty in organized crime, no clear path to anything. He grew avocados. He dropped out of school before completing his primary education. He crossed into the United States at some point in his early adult life, entering illegally, eventually becoming involved in drug trafficking in California. In 1994, the United States District Court for the Northern District of California sentenced him to 3 years in federal prison for conspiracy to distribute heroin. He served his sentence. He was deported back to Mexico. That deportation is the pivot point, the moment a different calculation was made. Back in Mexico, Cervantes did not step away, he went deeper. He became a police officer in Jalisco, a position that, in the architecture of organized crime in western Mexico, was not a retreat from criminal activity but a strategic entry into institutional knowledge, cover, intelligence, contacts, access to information about how law enforcement operated from the inside. He was removed from the force when his criminal associations were identified, but the understanding he had gained of how security forces operated, where their vulnerabilities were, how to think about surveillance and counter-surveillance, that knowledge would inform everything he built afterward. It gave him an edge that pure criminal backgrounds do not provide. He knew how the people hunting him thought because he had once been one of them. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, he had attached himself to one of the most powerful criminal structures in Western Mexico. He worked alongside enforcers connected to senior figures in Michoacan's criminal landscape before aligning with Ignacio Coronel Villarreal, known as Colonel, a senior Sinaloa cartel leader based in Jalisco. He was learning. He was ascending. Still, lieutenant, still operating inside structures other people had built. Not yet a boss. Not yet the man making the decisions. The structural move that analysts would later identify as essential came in the early 2000s. Oseguera Cervantes married Rosalinda González Valencia. Her brother was Abigail González Valencia, the leader of Los Queenies, a family-based criminal organization from Michoacan that had built sophisticated financial and money laundering infrastructure across multiple jurisdictions. Mexico City-based security consultant David Saucedo summarized the strategic significance of that marriage clearly. El Mencho reached the highest levels through a strategy of diplomacy via marriage. He was the enforcer. His wife's family provided the financial architecture, the money networks, the institutional reach. Together they had the two components a criminal empire requires: the capacity for violence and the capacity for finance. The enforcer and the banker joined by blood and marriage into a single operational structure. But the organization they would build together did not yet exist. In 2010, the criminal architecture of Western Mexico fractured in ways that created a specific opening. Nacho Coronel El Mencho's patron within the Sinaloa cartel structure was killed by Mexican army forces in Guadalajara on July 29th. That death removed the organizing figure around which an entire regional operation had been built. At nearly the same Oscar Orlando Nava Valencia, the Limlili cartel, under which El Mencho had been operating, was captured by Mexican authorities. The Milenio cartel splintered. Two factions más, Teoter la Resistencia. They fought for control of drug trafficking routes through Jalisco and surrounding states. Los Torcidos won, and Los Torcidos by approximately 2011 became what the world would come to know as the CJNG, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generation, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, with El Mencho at its head. What had been a lieutenant's position inside another man's organization had become a founding leadership role inside his own. What followed over the next 15 years was one of the most rapid and violent expansions of criminal power in the modern history of organized crime in the Americas. The D, as of the time of El Mencho's death, assessed the CJNG as having a presence in all 50 United States and in at least 21 of Mexico's 32 states. The organization had expanded globally with documented operations in Europe, including in the Netherlands and Belgium, where authorities identified CJNG involvement in port-based cocaine trafficking. The cartel's estimated annual revenue from cocaine and methamphetamine alone ran into the billions. And fentanyl, the synthetic opioid that became the primary driver of overdose deaths in the United States, had become one of the CJNG's central products under El Mencho's leadership. The DEAS head of the team tasked with locating El Mencho stated in an interview in 2019 that he believed El Mencho had a personal net worth of at least $500 million and possibly over $1 billion. The cartel distinguished itself through two things that set it apart from every other criminal organization in the country. The first was its willingness to directly and publicly confront the Mexican state at a level that other cartels actively avoided. In May 2000 Villa Purificación, Jalisco, CJNG gunmen used a rocket-propelled grenade to shoot down a Mexican military helicopter during an operation targeting the cartel. 9 soldiers were killed. This was not criminal violence of the conventional kind. This was an act of war against a government carried out in daylight, on camera, and without any apparent concern about the consequences that would follow. The message was deliberate and unmistakable. The CJNG was not going to behave like a cartel that hid from the state. It was going to demonstrate that it could fight the state directly and win. The second was the organization's military structure. The CJNG built what analysts described as the most heavily militarized criminal organization in Mexican history. Its training programs for armed operatives were described as strict and professional. It maintained a special operations capability for specific types of targeted violence. It acquired rocket launchers, armored vehicles, and military-grade weapons, and eventually began weaponizing commercial drones for attacks on security forces, a capability that had never been documented in Mexican organized crime before the CJNG deployed it. The government seized armored vehicles and rocket launchers at the site of the Tapalpa operation itself, confirming that even in what was supposed to be a low-profile hideout location, El Mencho traveled with military-grade equipment. In June 2020, that paramilitary capacity was demonstrated in the heart of Mexico City itself, when CJNG operatives carried out a brazen assassination attempt on Omar Garcia Harfuch, at that time the head of Mexico City's police force, using grenades and high-powered rifles on one of the capital's major thoroughfares. Garcia Harfuch survived. 3 members of his security detail and 1 civilian did not. The message, again, was deliberate. The CJNG would reach anywhere. It would strike anyone, including the top law enforcement official of the largest city in North America, in broad daylight, in the center of that city. Through all of this, El Mencho himself remained nearly invisible. Unlike El Chapo, who had given interviews and whose face was broadly known, El Mencho maintained almost total personal obscurity for the entire duration of his rise. He moved constantly. He communicated almost never electronically. He avoided any public presence. For years, verified photographs of him were almost non-existent. So U.S. government's wanted poster offering $15 million for information leading to his arrest used images that were outdated or uncertain. He was, by design, a ghost running one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Western Hemisphere from a position of near-total personal invisibility. His health complicated that invisibility in ways that ultimately created exploitable vulnerabilities. Multiple reports over the years indicated that El Mencho was dealing with serious kidney disease and required ongoing medical treatment. The need for medical infrastructure, doctors, medication, facilities, regular contact with medical personnel creates a signature. It creates movement patterns. It creates relationships with people who are reachable by outside investigators. And it creates the possibility that someone connected to those medical needs, or connected to the personal life that surrounds a man in poor health, can eventually be found and followed. Mexican and U.S. intelligence services had been systematically dismantling every protective layer around El Mencho for years before February 2026. Family members were arrested one by one. His son, Rubén Oseguera González, known as El Menchito, was extradited to the United States in 2020 and eventually sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years, with a forfeiture order of over $6 billion. His wife, Rosalinda González Valencia, was arrested in Mexico on money laundering charges in November 2021. His brother Abraham was arrested in Jalisco in April 2024. Another brother, Antonio, in 2022. The family network that had historically provided one of the key layers of the protective structure around him was being systematically removed. One arrest at a time across years of coordinated effort, but El Mencho remained free. He adjusted. He reduced his dependencies. He moved more carefully than ever. He maintained an inner circle small enough to limit the exposure that comes with trust, while keeping his organization running through what analysts described as a franchise model, regional bosses with substantial operational autonomy operating under the CJNG banner, maintaining their own local criminal structures, sharing profits and organizational identity without requiring constant direction from the center. This architecture meant the organization could function at full capacity even when the man at the top was completely unreachable and invisible. And it made finding him harder, not easier, because the cartel's day-to-day operations gave investigators almost nothing that led back to where he actually was. Then came February 20th, 2026. Mexican Defense Secretary General Ricardo Trevilla Trejo described what happened in the days leading up to the operation with precision in the press conference that followed El Mencho's death. Military intelligence had been tracking the movements of a trusted associate, a man closely connected to one of El Mencho's romantic partners. It is worth pausing on that detail. El Mencho had separated from his wife, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, in 2018. By the time of his death, he was involved with a different romantic partner entirely. That partner, and the trusted man in her immediate circle who moved with her, became the thread that unraveled everything. On February 20th, surveillance confirmed that this associate had transported the partner to a property within the Tapalpa country club, an upscale, gated residential development in the municipality of Tapalpa, in the wooded mountains of southern Jalisco. The partner met with El Mencho at the property. Then she left. El Mencho stayed. That single confirmed fact that he had stayed changed everything. Security forces had a location. They had confirmation of presence. They had a window of time in which the most wanted man in Mexico had not moved. The planning began immediately, and it was executed with a specific operational constraint that reveals how seriously Mexican intelligence understood the risk of the target learning about the operation before it could be launched. Ground forces were staged not in Jalisco but in adjacent states to avoid detection by the cartel's local informant networks. 6 military helicopters were deployed to staging positions in surrounding areas. The decision to keep all forces out of Jalisco until the precise moment of the assault was deliberate. The CJNG maintained informant NETWORKS inside Jalisco capable of detecting unusual military movement, and any visible buildup would have risked alerting El Mencho's security detail with enough time for him to disappear again. On the morning of February 22nd, 2026, after confirming that El Mencho remained at the property, Mexican Special Forces initiated the raid. 2 military helicopters provided direct air support. Ground forces advanced toward the gated compound on foot. Within the compound, cartel gunmen opened fire immediately. The exchange of gunfire was described as intense, with cartel members deploying high-caliber firearms and other heavy weaponry in an attempt to repel the assault. Several CJNG gunmen were killed during the initial push toward the main structure. During that initial confrontation, El Mencho attempted to flee. He moved into the surrounding wooded terrain with 4 members of his security detail, trying to use the mountain forest to escape the closing perimeter. A team of Special Forces personnel split from the main assault element and pursued him beyond the compound's perimeter. That pursuit led to a second armed confrontation in the wooded area adjacent to the property. El Mencho and 2 of his bodyguards were shot during that second firefight. 2 others were detained. 3 members of the Mexican armed forces were wounded during the full operation and transported for medical treatment. Armored vehicles and rocket launchers were seized at the site, confirming that even in what was supposed to be a discreet mountain location, the cartel's leader traveled with the organization's signature military hardware. El Mencho was critically wounded. He was airlifted from the site toward Mexico City. He died during that transport. The Mexican Defense Ministry confirmed his death on February 22, 2026. The man who had evaded to governments for over a decade, who had built one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the history of the Western Hemisphere, died in the air above the country he had spent 15 years demonstrating he could terrorize at will. CNN, using verified eyewitness footage from the operation, geolocated the site as a property known as Cabanas La Loma, a vacation rental near the Tapalpa Country Club, accessible via a long, remote driveway in the wooded mountains southwest of the town. Cabanas La Loma had been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury in 2015 and again in 2017 for providing what Treasury described as material assistance to the drug trafficking activities of the Jalisco cartel. He had been hiding in a place the other government already had a file on. The retaliation was not spontaneous. Set matters. It was coordinated, and it was activated within hours. The CJNG launched a nationwide response across at least 20 Mexican states. Security forces identified approximately 250 roadblocks nationwide. Vehicles were set on fire. Gas stations were targeted. Around 20 state-owned Banco del Bienestar branches were damaged. More than 200 OXXO stores were hit. A vehicle-borne improvised explosive device detonated near the perimeter of a National Guard installation. Puerto Vallarta was engulfed in smoke. Guadalajara, the capital of Jalisco and one of Mexico's largest cities, became, in the words of reporters on the ground that day, a ghost town. Stores closed. Public transport was suspended. Residents sheltered in place. Flights were cancelled across multiple major airlines, including Air Canada, Southwest, Alaska, and Delta, with operations suspended at Puerto Vallarta and Guadalajara airports. More than 1,000 visitors were stranded overnight at the Guadalajara Zoo alone. 25 members of Mexico's National Guard were killed in 6 separate attacks in Jalisco in the 24 hours following the operation. Among them was Captain Leonel Cardoso Gomez, assassinated by a car bomb. These were not people who built the fentanyl supply chain. They were soldiers who died in the coordinated retaliatory violence the operation triggered, violence that security analysts had anticipated as a probable consequence of any leadership strike against the CJNG, though its geographic reach across 20 states exceeded what most had publicly predicted. The man, identified by Mexican authorities as the organizer of that retaliatory violence, was Hugo Cesar Macias Serena, known as El Tuli El Mencho's right-hand man in Jalisco and top financial and logistics chief. El Tuli coordinated the nationwide blockades, the arson attacks, and the direct assaults on National Guard installations. He also reportedly offered a bounty of 20,000 pesos, approximately $1,100 for the killing of each soldier. Same-day security forces tracked El Tuli to El Gralo, a small town approximately 180 kilometers southwest of Guadalajara. He attempted to flee. He was killed in the ensuing confrontation. Authorities seized more than $965,000 and 7.2 million pesos from him. Within a single day, the CJNG had lost both its founder and the man who had immediately assumed operational control the moment that founder died. The U.S. role in the operation was confirmed by the Mexican Defense Ministry and publicly acknowledged by the White House. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stated that the U.S. had provided intelligence support. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landor described El Mencho publicly as one of the bloodiest and most ruthless drug kingpins in the world. President Claudia Sheinbaum was careful to characterize the cooperation strictly as intelligence sharing, emphasizing that no U.S. troops were involved in the operation itself. The Joint Interagency Task Force Cartel had mapped cartel presence and provided intelligence on CJNG movements in ways that proved decisive. In the final days of the manhunt, El Mencho's death came amid sustained pressure from the Trump administration on Mexico to take more aggressive action against cartels, which had been designated as foreign terrorist organizations, a designation that opened legal pathways for expanded U.S. military involvement and created additional financial liability for institutions with cartel connections. As security analyst Armando Vargas of Mexico Evalúa described it, the Mexican state made a calculation where the numbers worked out in its favor. There was not a better opportunity to capture him. The timing carried an additional and unavoidable dimension. Guadalajara is a host city for the 2026 FIFA World Cup. 4 group stage matches are scheduled there, including one featuring the Mexican national team, with authorities expecting around 3 million visitors. The images broadcast globally on February 22nd, a major international city filled with smoke. Its streets emptied by coordinated cartel retaliation arrived to a worldwide audience already closely watching Mexico's security situation in the context of the World Cup. The Mexican government now faces dual pressure, demonstrating to the world that Guadalajara is stable enough for millions of international visitors while simultaneously managing the most consequential criminal succession battle in the country's recent history. That succession battle is genuinely and dangerously open. El Mencho's son, El Menchito, is serving life plus 30 years in the United States. His wife was arrested in 2021. His brothers are in custody. Security consultant David Saucedo stated clearly that the line of succession has been broken. There is no obvious family successor positioned to step directly into operational control. Several names have emerged as Audias Flores Silva, known as El Jardinero, who controls key territory in Nayarit and Zacatecas. Gonzalo Mendoza Gaitan, known as Apo, who dominates the critical Puerto Vallarta corridor and oversees precursor chemical acquisition from China. Ricardo Ruiz Velasco, who leads the Tel's IT paramilitary wing. And Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, El Mencho's stepson, known as El Tres or El Pelon, identified by multiple analysts as the most likely heir apparent given his family connection and reported oversight of paramilitary operations. Chris Dolby of Diame Security Intelligence outlined the core problem clearly. The stepson would have to assume a huge role to replace the cult of personality El Mencho had built over 15 years. And if he cannot hold the organization together, you have 5-6 regional commanders, all with the money, the armed personnel, and the territorial control to create their own independent criminal structures. The CJNG's franchise model, which was its greatest strength under El Mencho, becomes its most dangerous liability in a succession crisis. Regional bosses who operated with substantial autonomy have no automatic reason to accept the authority of a successor they did not choose and who has not yet demonstrated he can command their respect. The cartel's primary objective, as retired D-Special Agent Derek Maltz noted, is to make money. That objective continues regardless of who leads the CJNG. The precursor chemical supply chains from China that feed fentanyl manufacturing in Jalisco and Sinaloa do not disappear with El Mencho's death. The laboratory networks do not shut down. The distribution corridors into the United States do not close. The demand in the United States that drives that manufacturing is unchanged. What changes is who controls those networks and collects the revenue they generate. The DEAS assessment that the CJNG operates as a franchise structure of approximately 90 affiliated organizations is unchanged. The franchise does not require its founder to keep running. It requires money and enforcement capacity, both of which remain fully present within the organization regardless of who sits at its top. What produced El Mencho was not a gap in law enforcement. It was poverty, institutional corruption, and a drug market in the United States generating revenue that dwarfs the GDP of most Mexican states. Replacing El Mencho with the same system that produced him does not change those conditions. It changes who benefits from them. Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes was 59 years old. He grew up in poverty in Michoacan. He dropped out of school. He grew avocados. He crossed a border illegally. He served federal prison time in the United States for heroin distribution. He was deported back to Mexico. He became a police officer. He became an enforcer. He became a boss. He built one of the most powerful and most violent criminal organizations in the history of the Western Hemisphere, with an estimated $50 billion in total assets and a presence across 5 continents. Under his command, the CJNG shot down a military helicopter with a rocket-propelled grenade. Under his command, a sitting top law enforcement official was attacked with grenades in the heart of Mexico City. Under his command, fentanyl and methamphetamine flowed into the United States at industrial scale. Under his command, tens of thousands of people died in cartel violence in overdoses driven by the drugs his organization supplied, and in the long collateral damage of a 15-year war his organization fought against the Mexican state. On February 22, 2026, the Mexican army found him in a wooded cabin in the mountains above Tapalpa, Jalisco. He had stayed one night too long. A woman had visited, and a trusted man had driven her there, and that thread had been followed with patience and precision by intelligence services who had spent years waiting for exactly this kind of moment. He was shot while fleeing through the woods. He died in the air on the way to Mexico City from wounds sustained in the firefight. And within hours, 25 National Guard soldiers were dead in retaliatory attacks. 250 roadblocks were burning across 20 Mexican states. And a country that had lived under the weight of his organization for 15 years was watching its cities fill with smoke. El Mencho is dead. The CJNG is not. The fentanyl supply chain is not. The poverty that produced him is not. The franchise of approximately 90 criminal organizations operating under the CJNG banner across more than 20 Mexican states is not. What changes when the founder dies is the succession. What does not change is the system that made him possible. That is the question that outlasts the operation. And it does not have a simple answer. If this investigation gave you a deeper understanding of what actually happened in Tapalpa and what it means for what comes next, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Drop or comment, do you believe El Mencho's death weakens the CJNG long term? Or does the fragmentation that follows make the organization more dangerous in the near term? The operation in Tapalpa was real. The death was real. The 25 soldiers killed in retaliation were real, and the consequences of the succession battle now underway inside one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world are still being determined. The investigation continues.